Welcome back to me talking way too long about all the class concepts I made up to fill up arbitrary slots in the table. Part 2, talking even longer. There are a lot of class concepts out there, including that one list that was floating around, allegedly sent by Blizzard as part of a survey. And I certainly hope that one was fake, because most of those were fairly uninspired. I think what's important about a class is that it represents a strong archetype that really resonates with what exists out there already. Did I fulfill those conditions myself? I'll let you be the judge as I get back to my table. While part 1 had a lot of canon classes, here we get some really wild original ideas. The very first one you'll see here is a Void Reaver. Identified as a Shadow Bruiser, it started its life as a What if Paladin, but Shadow, and really expanded from there. It's far from just that by now, and the core of their concept is a Void Parasite each Void Reaver is saddled with. Each Void Reaver is different in how and why they got their parasite, but one of the key sources were either the Dark Stars of Karesh, more on that some other time, or the alternate Draenor's Shadow Moon clan who delved into the void and pulled out things they shouldn't have. That is also the source of the name. A few mobs in AU Shadow Moon Valley. Their class trait allows them to hold up a void singularity originating from their parasite and draw in every projectile or melee attack nearby into them, making them great tanks. The next position you'll find here is the Night Warrior. Based on the canonical escapades of Tyrande, who, in her Night Warrior form, showed some rather unique abilities that didn't quite fit into any known class, it draws heavily from that lore. The average Night Warrior, of course, isn't as powerful as her, but is more like one of the dozens of Night Elves she empowered with her, as a result of a very risky ritual not dissimilar to Demon Hunters. There's other sources of Night Warriors in my lore, like worshippers of the Night Warrior aspect of Elune in the underground kingdom of Volthalas in the Dark Below, or the Tsukinoko of Yowakan, empowered by Elune, or Kaguya, as she's called in Yowakan, to protect the travelers in the night. There may be a bit of a Moon Knight in there. Their class trait conceals them automatically, breaking line of sight from any enemy that is far enough away. Shadowblade is a class concept that was largely pioneered by one of my players, and it's basically a shadow rogue, well, more shadowy rogue, who has to have a special shadow blade, a possessed weapon with a heavy, shadowy presence. There's a lot of possessions here. They also like to use a lot of gravity-based abilities, crushing and lifting their opponents. The class trait allows them to subvert some resource limitations and, for example, generate combo points with mana recovery rolls. Dark Adept has been largely inspired by Adepts from Mass Effect, and they focus on using ranged weapons, such as crossbows, as well as more of that gravity-based shadow magic. They use throws and pulls and lifts to toss people around like a Mass Effect Adept, and then shoot them down when disabled. Their class trait also plays into that, allowing them to ignore enemy stamina when forcing movement. The last shadow class here is simply Shadow Priest. In Canon WoW it's of course just a priest specialization, but it always had a lot of its own unique identity and concept and abilities. It's considered pretty much its own separate class in our system, and they're the only class that is able to land critical hits on aberrations. There is some idea shaping up about some other kind of Shadowcaster, perhaps some kind of Rift Mage that focuses on summoning shadowy creatures and aberrations. If we can shove the Shadow Priest more firmly into the Shadow Healer slot, perhaps. However, it's little more than just a rough idea right now, so I cannot say any more. When we get to Arcane, the first we see is a War Mage. This is a class concept that I held for a very long time, and it really stemmed from seeing some magic-possessing gods in Dalaran, for instance. They were clearly not just ordinary mages, and neither were they warriors, so the idea was born from there. And some sort of sword mage is certainly hardly a very original concept. In my system, their class trait borrows from Mass Effect again, and lets them charge, doing a double move with an attack, to any opponent, giving them a lot of mobility. The next one, Warden, was really hard to classify. Wardens used a lot of different abilities from all kinds of schools, doing some pretty significant shadow magic in their dots and their avatars. And I very nearly put them into the shadow branch, and I wouldn't blame anyone for doing it, but I already had those slots filled, and they also used arcane abilities such as Blink, so I justified it to say that in my universe they are primarily arcane users, and use similar abilities through arcane rather than shadow, even if they do have some shadow proficiencies. I know that in WoW a lot of their abilities were taken by rogues, but they are very clearly not rogues. They're wearing plate, and you're just trying to shove the wide variety of original concepts into WoW's very narrow framework, and it just simply cannot handle it. In my system, their class trait allows them to ignore difficult terrain, being able to blink over it. The Rune Master is a popular class concept in some circles, and is one that originates from the old Warcraft RPG. And it almost was an actual class in WoW, being considered for Wrath of the Lich King before Death Knight won out, and absorbed some runic mechanic ideas developed for the Rune Master. I don't blame them for choosing Death Knight for Wrath of the Lich King over Rune Master, but I always imagined what could have been. It was Warcraft's original monk before the actual monks showed up, using unarmed fighting with runic enhancements. In my system, their class trait allows them to use their inscription skills to write traits and abilities straight onto themselves, instead of their equipment. Spellbreaker was at the same time one of the oldest classes in my system, and newest. Way back when the whole system was much simpler, a lot of these class traits were implied, and we kinda knew what we could do. Like, Paladin had the ability to fear undead enemies. That's not what the class trait is now, as you would have learned in the previous part. That's what was treated like a class trait and wasn't actually written down anywhere before. I started writing things down since. But for example, back then Spellbreaker was mentioned as an example of such traits, allowing them to lifesteal barriers, something you normally couldn't do. But then, when the whole class trait system materialized, I somehow managed to omit them for a very long time, until recently when they were reimagined as an arcane trickster, an arcane rogue type, and given another ability to ignore enemy stamina when mind-controlling summoned outsiders such as demons or celestials. In the Arcane Ranger slot you will find two classes, the Artificer, who is also present in the Tech classes, when I didn't talk about it yet at the time, and the actual Ranger. The Artificer, separate from the Tinker in that they focus on magic and creation of magical items, also gained a lot of its identity in being based on the lore I invented for the Tanuks of Yoakan, tinkering little furry creatures and tricksters who create animated objects called Tsukumo from a tiny sliver of their own soul's anima. The class trait allows them to animate their weapons briefly to attack on their own, while they can continue fighting separately, besides having their own summoned Tsukumo pet. The actual Ranger would normally need little introduction, but in WoW, I find it strange that it's such a remote concept that not even a lot of people consider. Most of the time when you mention a Ranger, people tell you, oh, there's already a Hunter. Yeah, and we already have warriors. Does that mean we can't have paladins and death knights? Like, people still act, developers and players still act like having one class with ranged weapons is enough, because that class already does ranged weapons. We have tons of classes that are doing melee weapons. It's not a barrier to anything. A ranger and a hunter are two very different things, no matter how many magical spells Blizzard shoves into the hunter skills. There's a lot of magical archer types in Warcraft lore, from Priestess of the Moon to Dark Ranger to Shadow Hunter to Naga Sea Witches, and each of them can stand on their own. My ranger, with their class trait, can apply magic to their arrows to grant them, for example, fire damage or an electric stun effect. Mages probably actually need very little introduction. They're the primary arcane casters. that everyone knows, and in my system their class trait is called Font of Power, and allows them to slowly regenerate mana in combat, something you can't normally do without rolling for it or drinking potions. Sorcerers, on the other hand, started as a conversion of the D&D sorcerer, and their class trait was Meta Magic, allowing them to repeat their main action with a bonus action for the cost of extra mana, which is meant to resemble using meta magic to, for example, twin a spell or empower a spell. You're doing the spell twice via meta magic. And it uses mana instead of sorcery points because there is no mana in D&D. Here we use the mana for it. It may sound powerful until you realize it just means they're essentially dual-wielding spells. But soon I incorporated them into the lore of a few worlds, including Atlantean sorcerers on Earth, and now they have a proper place on the class table. Last arcane class you'll see here is a bard. Now, I can already hear some questions. Is bard a silly class idea? Yes. Is that a problem? No. I don't see why we shouldn't have bards, just because they're dancing and playing around. A little light-hearted class with some flair and style isn't going to hurt you or your sense of gritty realism among the goblin shenanigans and Draenei spaceships. Warcraft is not a very serious or dark setting. So here's bards, who heal you with music and hurt people by playing heavy metal. To parrot Lucio, they have an aura that buffs everyone around them just a little. Now that we get to Chaos or Fel classes, we start with a Blackguard. The name should be familiar to those who have been in the TTRPG scene for a while. It used to be sort of an anti-paladin. It's also where it started for me, but also greatly developed since then. Here, Blackguards are demonic knights, trained by the Nathrezim or the Pit Lords, and being fearsome juggernauts who can use their fel magic to subvert most mental immunities. Normally, undead and demons resist fear and other such effects. Blackguards don't care, because they were trained to terrify even things that normally can't feel fear. They take a lot of the other Pit Lord abilities like large glaives and summoning fissures and rain of fire to create this concept of a demonic knight that really grows beyond the paladin roots. Felsworn, defined here as the Fel Monk, originates from the old RPG, like a lot of these do. Our class fantasy for it also borrows a lot from the dark apotheosis warlocks were once able to do. The Felsworn essentially summons a demon into themselves and uses that demon's power to fuel their abilities, mostly to claw at people with demonic growths. For the class trait, called adaptability, if they buff themselves, they can switch that buff to another ability when needed, so they can change their buff from, say, attack to control. Demon hunters probably need little introduction. We all love our edgy boys who sacrificed everything, and what have you given? Illidari got pretty big in our universe, and demon hunters are more popular than ever. For their class trait in our system, they ignore most enemies' backstab bonuses, seeing through stealth with the spectral sight. Imagine if they could do that any time in WoW. I would maybe actually play one in the MMO. Fel Cannoneer is meant to fill the slot of a Fel/Ranger. Instead of bows or crossbows, they prefer the magical energy guns, the large Fel cannons that I also built a lot of lore on. In our universe, Fel cannons, fueled by souls when wielded by someone unpracticed, will drain their own soul to fire. However, the guns also have a soul siphon, which drains nearby enemies to fuel the weapon. As their class trait, the Fel Cannoneer uses their mana, or soul shards, or whatever other resource they have, as their Fel Cannon's weapon durability, meaning they can use their own energy to fire the weapon, or drain others to refill that energy. Warlocks once again need little introduction. They're your favorite demon summoning, soul-sucking friends who always run around with a succubus, and you don't ask them what they're doing with it. Especially since succubi are supposed to kill you if you get your hands on with them. No, really, what are they doing with... Anyway, warlocks get life tap for a class trait, being allowed to use their health, like mana, to empower their spells. Heretics are one of my more recent additions, being added as a charismatic quasi-religious leader. When they're an enemy, they're cult leaders who convince the foolish masses to worship demons and ruin their worlds. When they're a PC, they're mavericks and manipulators who twist the will of their enemies. Either way, they relish in chaos and randomness they spread. For their class trait, heretics got what I called an inspiring word. So whenever they inspire someone with extra actions, that person is briefly brought up to the heretic in the initiative order. And this is, once again, getting pretty long, since we are getting into a lot of the original classes. So I will split this video into another part, continuing further down into nature and death classes next time. And hopefully that will be the end of it, if people are still watching this. Don't forget to like and subscribe and comment and do all the YouTube things, and I hope to see you next time.